Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm John Kiriakou. The Federal Reserve is expected to hike the federal funds rate today by 0.75 percentage point to 2.4%. That's a mile marker of sorts because many economists say it's a level that no longer encourages economic growth. And remember, just over 4 months ago, the federal funds rate was almost zero. The whole point of this is to bring inflation under control, and some economists are predicting that the Fed will actually increase rates by a full percentage point today. We'll see what happens. Pundits are talking about a hard landing or a soft landing, but we should put those words in human terms. Higher interest rates will slow the economy. Sure, they're supposed to tame inflation too, but does low inflation matter when you've just lost your job? We're joined by Steve Grumbine, founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. He's also a leading activist and evangelist for modern monetary theory. Steve, always good to have you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, John.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Steve, reading the financial papers today, it was like a throwback to 1979 or 1980 when I was a paper boy. We're going to see another huge jump in interest rates, and the talk is all about inflation. Is that what we should be focusing on? What's your opinion?
No, I mean, look, this is tough. I had this real energetic response waiting to happen, John. And, you know, I recognize that this is hard for people to get their head wrapped around, okay? All of our lives, we've been told that inflation is a result of printing money. We have Zimbabwe thrown at us. We have Venezuela thrown at us. We have Weimar Republic thrown at us. And we always go to this. And this is Milton Friedman was kingpin of explaining that to us. So for better than a half a century, way more than half a century, I mean, go back to the 60s, we're talking about, what, 60 years now, right? So we've got 60 years of neoliberal thought that has been pumped into our school systems, pumped into our government, pumped into our media. I even jokingly, it's not a joke, but I jokingly used the return of Roseanne Barr a few years ago when they brought Roseanne out of the, back into the mainstream. And the very first episode was right after the Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders famous primary. And Roseanne starts the show off fight with her sister saying, hey, the only problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. Right. And her sister had voted for Jill Stein, apparently. So this thinking is very deeply rooted in everything from the churches to our schools to our comic books, even Marvel superheroes. All these things are reinforcing this narrative. It's almost impossible to get away from. But the fact is that inflation is brought on by a number of things, not the least of which, ironically, is raising interest rates, because you're literally creating an inflated cost of credit. So right off the bat, you're starting with killing inflation with creating inflation, okay? The other thing is that they're also, because they don't know of any other way, it's like bleeding the patient, they come in with a blunt force object to say, hey, in order to curb inflation, we also now have to create unemployment. So between raising interest rates and creating unemployment, none of this has said anything about why we have inflation. And the inflation that we're looking at here is, number one, we've got a shortage of the most ubiquitously needed product in the world right now, and that is petroleum products. Not just refined gasoline, but oil products and other lubricants that petroleum products are found in. So whenever you've got a scarcity there, it touches everything. It drives costs up. The other thing is, during the middle of a pandemic, we had supply chains break down. What do you do when you have supply chains breaking down? You have bad bottlenecks in the infrastructure. Your highway systems aren't right. Your train systems aren't right. What do you do to fix that? Do you cut spending, or do you invest in improving your infrastructure?
Right.
Well, it's a stupid question because there's only one right answer there, but you get the point. But the thought is that because we printed money, which isn't a thing, by the way, but because they say we printed money, therefore we have to stop doing that and we have to cut back on it. So Biden's out there touting $2 trillion in deficit reduction. This is literally the things that kill and create a recession, which I know we're going to talk about a little later.
Yeah.
So all the things that you see that you're hearing about with the Fed doing, this is like taking a small child and beating them over the head with a baseball bat and saying they'll improve. And that's literally the worst possible answer.
Yeah, agreed.
It's a long answer, but that's the answer.
No. I appreciate it. We're told that the Fed's goal, of course, is to get inflation to 2% or lower, and that to do that, we may see another huge interest rate increase again in September. Would that be the right move? Another increase would put us in that restrictive range where the economy would be expected to shrink. But isn't that where even more damage is done?
Let me ask you a question. Do you discipline the little people and keep them from purchasing things they need?
Right.
Or do you go ahead and deploy solutions on the other side by instituting price caps or regulation instead of, hey, if we don't have enough fuel in the United States right now to service our needs to keep prices at a level that we need it, what would prevent the president from using his emergency powers to go ahead and put a temporary embargo on exporting of oil to make sure that we have enough in this country? This is the problem right now, is that we put all the discipline on labor, the discipline on consumers, the discipline on families, as opposed to the discipline on big business and the discipline on the regulatory environment and the regulatory framework that could control abusive market power. But instead, we keep making life harder for regular people.
It's true.
And this whole concept of what the Fed's trying to do is a monetarist viewpoint of the world. They see interest rates and bonds as the be-all, end-all, but these things happen after the spending. We don't fund our government with bonds. So bonds are really a relic of the gold standard era. We could eliminate them. We could drop back down to a 0% interest rate. We could invest in the infrastructure, fix that stuff. We could put curbs on the export of oil to prevent them from making a scarcity in this country by just simply having a decent federal energy policy, or at least a temporary one under emergency orders to fix it after a pandemic, none of which will they do because it's an ideological stronghold. Neoliberalism has. It's a belief of laissez-faire markets, and we are always going to be the people they discipline, always.
Well, why is it that we aren't considering price caps? You know, Nixon did it in the 70s, and it worked.
Yep.
So why not do it again?
Yeah. Well, you think about this. Go back to the 50s and the Mount Pelerin Society as Milton Friedman and his gang of Chicago school folks were getting their hooks in everything. You saw what they did with Pinochet in Chile. You saw what they've done with Volcker. These guys, it's taken years for them to really, really exact the price that they needed to exact. But this is all with the intent of destroying the gains made by the New Deal. This is all about destroying the concept of the public purpose. Remember Margaret Thatcher's famous line, "There is no public money. There is only taxpayer dollars." And so this mantra, this lie, by the way, because there is no such thing as taxpayer dollars, only public money. She got it completely backwards, right? And so if you understand that, then it starts to fundamentally unravel every one of these things they're telling us. Literally, this is it's an earth-shattering thing. I've said it on this program several times. I'm going to say it one more. The goal of taxation by the federal government is not to fund itself because it creates its own money. The issue for taxation is to provision itself by creating a need for the currency. You have to pay your taxes in U.S. dollars. This is how the government gets us into motion. But more recently, since the takeover of the corporate sector over our government, the capture of our institutions, now that discipline is there for us so that we will be good, compliant workers for corporate America.
Right.
And this is the rationale. So when you go back to Nixon, while some of this stuff was brewing underneath the surface, but it was still nascent, it was still just the beginning phases of the neoliberal project. I mean, neoliberalism really took off right after World War II when we tried to attack communism and try to block Joseph Stalin. I like calling him Joe Stalin. You know, they try to block that from happening by creating the Peace Corps and the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank and all these things to create this neoliberal project that was counter to communism and socialism. So every structure, every single bit of government propaganda has been to keep us away from social beliefs in society, to keep us away from the public purpose, to eradicate what is considered the public space and only have the private space. So Biden would literally have to violate the very tenets of neoliberalism to embrace price caps. And Nixon didn't have that burden yet. It hadn't really taken off in the way that it has today.
Right. Steve, the White House is adamant, and we heard this again this morning from the president. The White House is adamant that the economy is not entering a recession. The president is asked about it regularly, and he always says the same thing. There is no recession on the horizon. The media aren't so sanguine, but today's New York Times says that it's impossible to say if we're heading into a recession. What are your thoughts?
First of all, that's bullshit. It's super simple to see some of these things, okay? It's called sectoral balances, okay? And if you go to the St. Louis Fed, you can go pull up their sectoral balances. And what sectoral balances do is they look at the balance of payments for the rest of world. That's sector one. Mm-hmm. They look at the public debt. That's sector two. Public debt being the federal government's ability to issue dollars. And then they look at private debt. Those are the three things, okay? Private debt is starting to blow up. People are trying to take on more and more private debt to survive, to fill the hole in the economy that the federal government's job should be there to provide for the general welfare, to enhance the public purpose, and they're failing on that. So when you look at that, you realize, number one, private debt's going up. People are going to get maxed out. They won't be able to take on any more debt. Add in August 31st as student debt starts kicking back in, okay?
Right.
If Biden doesn't get rid of that altogether, people like myself who have $126,000 of student debt will suddenly have $1,000 a month monthly payment on their shoulders that they have to deal with out of nowhere, okay?
Yeah.
Now, you're a family. You have a choice. You either pay your house, like Sankara says, I can either pay you or we can die. Which is it going to be? I'm choosing to survive. We're going to survive. We're not going to pay that debt. So, all these things are coming up. And the definition of a recession is lack of growth, negative GDP, negative growth. And we've got that. So we have a real legitimate textbook definition of a recession now. They're playing fast and loose with terminologies. But trust me when I say this, GDP is an indiscriminate judge of all financial transactions. So with that in mind, that means disaster payments. That means foreclosures are part of GDP. That means student debt, is part of GDP. It means all these things are part of GDP. And they're not productive GDP. They're not productive for the economy. They don't help any of us, okay?
Right.
So if you think about what I'm saying, this becomes uglier by the second. And the idea that we're not entering into a recession is a very, very privileged position to take for those people who are sitting in the catbird seat collecting the additional monies brought on by the interest rate hikes. Because think about it. Those interest rate hikes, one person's spending is another person's income.
Yeah, that's right.
An accounting identity. It's a truth. So that interest payment is going somewhere, okay? It's not going to the federal government. The federal government doesn't need that interest payment. Taxes, when it takes taxes, it deletes them. So what does that mean? That means somebody rich is getting more money. It's exacerbating the wealth gap. So when you see this is literally the rich trying to take a bite out of what they thought was the little people getting over by getting some pandemic relief. We got to get a piece of that. How do we get a piece of that? Let's go ahead and raise interest rates.
Yeah.
And that's what you're seeing here. And you know what? Somebody can tell me I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I won't buy it. I don't believe it for a second. I mean, the issue is all these bonds and all these interest rate hikes are in essence a basic income for people who already have money. That's what that is. And so this whole approach, every bit of this is a true class war. true, honest to God, austerity is murder kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And it's devastating. I hope I didn't bore you with that, but that's literally what's on my mind.
And I'm glad that you explained it that way, because that's exactly how I feel. I want to expand that, actually. It seems to me that the world's economies are almost too interconnected to be able to plan independently. The IMF, for example, said today that it expects a global recession in the coming months. Is it that U.S. actions could push the world into recession, or is it that U.S. actions are secondary to what's happening in the rest of the world? Does the Fed really control what's happening in the U.S. economy, or is it more global and interdependent?
So the boogeyman of the Federal Reserve is a construct of conspirators going back to 1913.
Yes, indeed.
Okay? Imagine the Fed sitting in the passenger seat with a kid toy steering wheel with you all going on vacation. That's the Fed, okay? But because people have gotten so caught up in the Rothschild libel and all the other things that went on, these guys have got it in their head. The fact is, there's two separate forms of the world. There's fiscal policy that is a direct behavior from Congress, and then there is in the United States, and we can talk about the rest of the world if we want for a minute. But the Fed, all they control is interest rates. That's it. They literally control interest rates and debt management of those bonds, bond servicing and interest rates. So when you think about it, the real factor here is Congress can pass a spending bill tomorrow to literally put into motion whatever needs to be done. That's in the United States, but on a global scale. Many of these countries have been lured into debt arrangements with the IMF to be able to, quote unquote, become good, proper capitalist countries that can be hospitable markets for global corporations, multinational corporations. And that is the goal of the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, since Joseph Stalin and them decided they were enemies after the end of World War II. And that has been what's going on. So when you think about what the U.S. government can do, many countries, because they don't have the strength of production, they don't have the resilient economy, they will peg their currency to the United States dollar. Well, the ebbs and flows of the United States dollar have tremendous impacts on other countries who have to have enough foreign reserves to cover their U.S.-denominated debts. And so that means that they have to do many things that they maybe wouldn't otherwise do. And so this definitely impacts them, but it doesn't have to. There are ways around that. And guys like Kiriakou, who is the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a phenomenal Tunisian economist who works in third world countries and works with people like Ndongo Sambasila, out of Africa. These are guys that are really driving the point home that there are ways around IMF loans, that there are ways around buying into the neoliberal project. Guys like Pakistani economist Akhtar Afzal will talk to you about these groups need to come together and build trading blocks together to avoid the presence of U.S. imperialism. So there's many things that could be done, but because they don't understand this and they're trapped in a neoliberal paradigm themselves, coupled with a military that's saying do this or die, okay? These guys literally are stuck in a neoliberal debt trap that makes them, by extension, basically neo-colonial properties, if you will. The countries are no longer there with their white safari hats on from Great Britain and Africa. It's now instead this neoliberal construct of the IMF. And of course, you've got all the destabilization that I'm sure you're well aware of with our CIA and other things that go into these countries to create conditions that make them take deals. I mean, go back, I don't know how much of it's salacious or not, but I tend to think, Confessions of the Economic Hitman tell us an awful lot. And if you think about that, you understand the role that the U.S. dollar plays in that. But it's not a deathlock. They have choices, and they just don't understand them. So hopefully these great economists that understand, who are out there working like Kiriakou, who I absolutely admire in a way that brings tears to my eyes. I mean, he's doing God's work right now, okay? He's out there just trying so hard. I mean, it's like beat your head into a brick wall trying to explain this stuff to people. But that's what's happening right here is ultimately United States government through its great arm of the IMF and other things have really played a psyop on these other countries to make them believe that there is no alternative. But you're seeing alternatives, sadly, in the wrong way with this division because of Ukraine and Russia. You're watching a balkanization of the world be split into the white countries and the non-white countries, and this concept of cooperation that you see with Russia, China, and the others versus this concept of predation within the NATO space is really terrifying. So I think this story goes deeper than just inflation or not inflation. I think it really is a geopolitical thing. It's not necessarily an economic one. MMT, while it is a theory of fiat currency, is not a theory of all things. So it doesn't always explain everything that's going on here.
Sure.
But you can certainly assess the balance sheets to understand what's going on. And what's going on is massive amounts of predation because they don't understand there is an alternative.
Steve, I want to ask you about something that I don't fully understand. What do you think the latest economic news means for the stock market? And the reason why I'm asking you about the stock market is that some economists are warning right now that a big crash is coming because of high inflation, high interest rates, and a slowing housing market, but that the crash isn't necessarily going to be in the stock market. They're saying that it could be in the bond market. Can you explain how that would happen and why that's so important?
Yeah, I don't fully understand why they would say it, because the bond market is the most secure thing ever.
Yeah, okay? Right.
And when the U.S. government sells a bond, when it sells that bond, it sells it with certain terms and conditions, and it pre-funds it. So it knows you have to buy U.S. bonds, by the way, in U.S. dollars. You can't buy them in yen, won, renminbi. You can't do it in pounds. You have to buy it in U.S. dollars. So obviously what's happening is, at least the intent of this originally was to remove buying power, to provide a safe investment that earns a nominal interest rate like a savings account. So think of bonds largely as savings accounts at the Fed or at the Treasury. These savings accounts are there to delay purchasing power. At least that's the way it was started, right? Like we sold war bonds during World War II. Why? Why did we sell them? Was it to finance the war? No, we had already financed the war. The reason we sold them was because our factories were operating at 110% capacity, while simultaneously you had people that wanted to buy things, and there was nothing to buy. So what happens when you have people going after these things with their extra money, because they've been working round the clock, they're putting in overtime, they're working crazy hours and getting more money than usual. So what happens if there's nothing to buy? Then you will have inflation. That's the scarcity. That's when demand is outpacing supply. Okay, so what did they do? They sold war bonds to prevent these kinds of purchases during a time where all the factories needed to be pointed to the war effort. At least that's the thinking. So if you think about the bond market today, what is the bond market serving? It is simply a safe bet for people that have U.S. dollars that don't know what to do with them, that want something that is low risk, zero risk, etc. So to me, I wouldn't sweat the bond market. It's the one thing that we have absolute control over, right? We set the terms of the bonds. We set the terms of those. And in my opinion, based on my studies and based on the people that I respect, we should stop selling long-term treasury bonds and stuff. We should stop pretending that we have to sell bonds to offset spending. And we should get rid of the interest on reserves and all the other things like that. I really believe that these are ways of making sure that the rich stay rich no matter how bad the economy is. And really this bond market thing, I will tell you this, unfortunately, a lot of pensions and a lot of other things invest in the bond market so that they can deal with the ebbs and flows of the larger stock market. But the fire sector itself is where all this money goes. It doesn't make it to Main Street. It goes to people who already have money that are willing to take a chance and risk and invest. And this is the casino that has become the United States economy. So as long as the casino is flowing, that counts as part of GDP, right? So it gives a false positive that the economy is doing just great. But I can tell you right now, me, myself, and I have no investments. So I don't have any money to invest in. And I think most people are living hand to mouth. So this false positive in the stock market doing well and see people talking about, oh, my lithium, blah, blah, blah. Oh, this is not real. It's a fake thing, man. I mean, I'm sure there's aspects of it that are real, but a guy named Eric Dean, great economist, is going to be working at this Torrens University in Australia teaching MMT. He talked about how corporations have become nothing more than a giant stock portfolio, that they're not even producing anything. They're just a big portfolio to manage, a money market to manage. And when stock A doesn't work, they just cut it away. And there goes all those jobs until somebody picks it up on pennies on the dollar. Mm-hmm. And this is what our world has become. So when you look at the stock market, when you look at the bond market, it's important to understand that if you're buying U.S. bonds, there's nothing to prevent the U.S. government from funding when you sign that bond, you bought it 3% or whatever, that's the terms of that bond. Mm-hmm. You're talking about bond vigilantes not being able to sell more, cry me a river, old man river.
Yep.
You know,
yep.
Right. Big deal. I'm not going to lose an ounce of sleep over that guy not getting that. So,
Steve, we hear a lot of politicians.
I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for.
Oh, no, it's awesome. We hear a lot of politicians in Congress talking about trying to get a hold of inflation. Several members of Congress have been very vocal about passing legislation that they say would tame inflation, but there hasn't been any action. Does this even matter? Is there anything that Congress can do to address inflation, or is this something that that's just going to either have to run its course, or we have to allow the Fed to wreck the economy to bring it under control?
Okay, just remember, inflation. Are we talking about supply chains? If we're talking about supply chains, you got to go ahead and invest in infrastructure. Yes. That will take care of supply chain-driven inflation. Indeed. If we're talking about people having too much money, so to speak, to spend and not enough goods and services, you want to enhance production. If it's never a matter of quote unquote printing money, and I want to finish that thought because it's super important.
Yeah.
Taxes delete currency. So even when the government spends, taxes will pull that out. It's gone. So the only thing that puts more money in is a spending bill. However, if there's a taxing bill, the money gets gotten rid of. And we know money has a natural helium effect, so it goes up to the top where it circles around in the fire sector. Okay? So what can Congress do? Congress can institute price controls where people are gouging. They can go ahead and invest heavily in actual regulatory environments that keep corporations from using abuse of market power. They can remember what it's like to trust bust. They can remember what it's like to go after monopolies. They can remember those things. They can literally prevent foreign investment in the real estate market. They could literally do all those things, but they're not doing it. Why? Because it goes back to the very first thing I said on this call. Neoliberalism is an ideology that this president embraces fully, and that the Democratic Party and Republican Party in joint love fest celebrate to the high heavens.
Yep.
So, you know, crucify me for being an honest truth teller, but that's the deal. I wish I could say the Democrats are the good guys, but they each are different evil, and they both work hand in glove in making this dystopian world that we're in a reality.
See, I always say in response to people who tell me that I'm throwing away my vote by voting for a third party, that I'm better off and the country is better off just choosing the lesser of two evils. And my response has always been that the lesser of two evils is still evil. And so we forcing ourselves into a box of one party or the other, to me, is wasting your vote. I agree with you. They're both flawed.
Think about this for a minute, if you will. Sometimes it's better to flip the coin in the football game and choose to defend instead of receive, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes we make a decision that it's better to play defense. When you have a feckless corpse and a cop like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden as your people that you're putting up there, and then you have 3/4 of the bourgeois Karens of the world going back to sleep. And lo and behold, while they were in slumber, Roe v. Wade got pulled out from under them, right? So ultimately, you're going to have different forms of evil coming up, and it's a matter of which evil you're willing to tolerate. In the end, the poor lose no matter who's in office.
Yeah.
And so to me, I look at it this way. We had 9/10 of America backing us up in united opposition to Trump's bigotry and some of the more strident, crazy religious type things that he put forward with the religious right. People were united to push back on that. Where are those people now united in the same? Instead of build the wall, we're now increasing border security.
Yep.
Instead of, you know what I mean? Like all these different ways of saying the same thing. So at the end of the day, we just lost 3/4 of the army. Mind you, they're not a permanent army. Those are centrists. They go back to sleep when Democrats are in office. So to me, I think that we lost by winning, so to speak, if you know what I mean.
We're going to leave it there. That was the voice of Steve Grumbine. He's the founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. He's also a leading activist and evangelist for modern monetary theory. You're listening to Political Misfits. We're going to take one more break and come back, so stay tuned.